Delighted you're here. I'm delighted to be here. My talk today is called Heartfelt Liberation, as you might have gleaned from some of the other the affirmations this morning. You know, you've heard this saying before, your mind is like a parachute. It only works when it's open. And the mind and the science of mind, this means a lot of things. It means a conscious awareness, first of all, but it means feeling, it means intuition, it means that inkling. It means all those sensory systems. It means the information that you glean through emotions. And it's also those beliefs, both hidden and conscious. And therefore, there is, to open the science of mind means that one creates with all of these aspects of mind. And liberation and freedom is like a perfect example because of how this plays out personally in one's life. You can have all the outward signs of freedom, you can have all the outward signs of liberation, and yet still not feel free. We live in a free society. America is a free society, has been since its inception, and yet there are a lot of folks that don't feel free in many important aspects of their life. Now, you manifest and you realize this liberation when that feeling really takes you over, when you feel free, or maybe you feel freer, and you feel it in the heart and in the mind, all those aspects of mind. You feel it all around your being, and that's where you're actually in the liberation, that heartfelt liberation. Now, this holiday season, and I've mentioned that I really resonate with this holiday season, the Easter, Passover, the equinox, all of the things that go with the polytheistic traditions that are actually most of the symbols incorporated into Easter. And liberation, freedom, is really a universal quality of a lot of those holidays. Now, the resurrection, which was last Sunday, and we talked about, that's kind of a metaphor for a liberation of spirit, say, from body. It's the recognition of this eternal and ongoing one life, and that's the one life of which you and me and all creation is a part. So that's the liberation of the resurrection. Passover is a metaphor for a liberation on many levels, but today I'm going to talk about a liberation from limiting beliefs, from unshackling, let's say, from any idea or feeling, inkling, intuition of lack, of limitation, of scarcity, of density, from any of that kind of stinking thinking. That's the sort of liberation that the Passover holiday represents for me. And Joseph Campbell, one of my favorites, said, the role of myth is to make one transparent to the transcendent. The role of myth is to make one transparent to the transcendent. Well, Easter and Passover are really, really rich myths when you look at them. And, there's some folks that spend a lot of time and energy trying to kind of literalize these stories, these biblical accounts. It's really easy to do because the events are presented as kind of a factual history, and they are part of an oral history at first. But I feel that literal interpretation kind of misses the bigger, better value. It's kind of the difference between the window frame and the view. A literal interpretation focuses on the frame and misses the view. But the Bible as metaphor points the way. It points the way, so you look at where it is pointing. That's where it connects you to this direct, numinous experience of God, this direct connection to God. Now remember, my point of view about this biblical material is I really focus on the fact that it was an oral tradition. It was an oral tradition. Everything that's in the Bible, for the most part, started out as an oral tradition. And after it got repeated several generations, eventually some of this stuff started to get written down. Now, as oral traditions go, you kind of sacrifice accuracy for making it more memorable. It's just like that fish tale that every time you tell it, the fish grows another inch. And so this is true of how some ordinary experiences in the growth of Hebrew people got inflated into things that are much bigger than life so that people would remember it, so it would have this lasting impact for their spiritual maturation. Now, unlike us Western literal linear thinkers, Near Easterners don't really have any problem with this sort of hyperbolic speech. because they just get it. It's part of their culture. It's part of their customs. And they don't trip over some of those, more epic details. They really just get the meaning. So context is really everything. And so to take these stories, these traditions as metaphor, knowing they started out as an oral tradition that have sort of expanded into mythic proportions, that's where you really start to plug into that radical, that root, that transmittive quality of these biblical stories. It's kind of like a great movie where you just really, really immerse. You've suspended your disbelief and you are in that story. You lose yourself in the characters, the action. You might put yourself in the middle of what's going on, these extraordinary feats, the special effects. And what happens is that veil, that sort of that thin thing between you and the divine, it just disappears. And this is what it disappears to is, as we would call in Star Wars, the Force, right? But Ernest Holmes, the founder of religious science, put it that, he used to start his show and says, there's a force greater than you in the universe, a force for good greater than you in the universe, and you can use it. And so that's the thing, that being in this story, when you lose yourself and get into the story, that is the part that you are connecting to, that force for good that's greater than you. And so in a really good myth, like the book of Exodus, let's take a character like Moshe, or Moshe. We call him Moses, but it means, it comes from an Egyptian derivative, meaning on the water or of the water. Won't have to, that's a talk for another, a story for another talk. But at times, Moshe was using the force for good, and at other times that force for good was using him. Because there were times where he was invoking that power of God within him to accomplish whatever it was he was having to accomplish. And there are other times that force was saying, Moshe, this comes through you. The good of God is coming through you. So he both uses the force for good in the universe, and the force for good in the universe uses him. Now, this isn't to try to in any way minimize or trivialize, pull a great epic story into your personal life and therefore kind of deflate it or disrespect it on some level, nor is it to try to take what is ordinary in your life and over-dramatize it. Take some ordinary challenges and by laying yourself up against an important story like Passover or the Exodus to take it all out of proportion. But by putting yourself in aspects and facets of any great myth, you can find that greater meaning for you. And what you're doing is you're finding the God that's operating in you. You're finding that God that is operating through you. You're finding that God that is operating as your life. And that is being then completely transparent as you can be to the transcendent. In the science of mind, God is operating in, through, and as your life. That's part of what we teach. And if you open to it, everything about your life then tends to contribute to you expressing and experiencing more of your goodness, more of your godness. And that is to live more out of that true essence that is at the heart of every being, and that true essence is pure spirit. Passover celebrates the Israelite Exodus, and that begins with getting free from Egyptian slavery. And Moshe is called by God to tell the Pharaoh to set the enslaved Hebrews free, and he's telling him to set them free for a specific purpose. And the specific purpose is so that they can worship in the wilderness, so they can practice their teaching and their religion freely. And that's the highest priority. And of course, Moshe resists on a lot of different levels. It's like, well, who am I to do this? And this sets up one of these really pivotal theological moments in the Bible that gets lost in translation. And almost all the Bibles, English Bibles anyway, I'm not really reading Czechoslovakian Bibles, but in the English Bibles, they leave this particular phrase, and it happens a few times. I mentioned one last week for Easter, in the original language. In this case, it would be an Aramaic derivative. And, Moshe says, well, who am I? And God says, well, you tell him that God sent you. Well, what are we calling God? Because in the Hebrew tradition up to that point, it was inappropriate to give God a name. And God says that Ahia Ashar He. That's the phrase, Ahia Ashar He, which means, and again, Aramaic is a very simple language, so a word can mean many things depending on the context. And it's intentionally chosen this way because the reference to God is left to the context of the language. But at times, Ahia Ashar He can mean, I am the living God. I am living spirit. I am all that this moment requires. I am the beloved one. So Ahia Ashar He, that can mean a lot of things. But what it doesn't mean is I am that I am. So that's where the translation gets lost, right? It means living God, living spirit, whatever this present moment is. It means the beloved. And so this is a defining moment in the Hebrew evolution, in the Israelites' evolution. Because up to then, they did have a one-God system. They were a monotheistic monotheistic faith, but what they had done originally was taken one or two or three of the polytheistic gods and sort of glommed them together and was saying, well, that's one God that has all of these, two or three characteristics. But at this point, this discussion, and this is called a theophany because there is an actual dialogue between Moshe and God, that now we're talking about an all-encompassing God, an all-powerful God, an all-overarching, indwelling, everywhere in the moment God. And this is a new definition for the Hebrew people, and it's a position of empowerment that they're taking in this step on their spiritual journey. And this is and they continue throughout the evolution or throughout the Bible. God gets clarified and refined as the spiritual consciousness of the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, is maturing. And that is the common thread or arc of the Bible when it's seen that way. So, because this process is leading to this eventual release from slavery, plague by plague by plague, distinctions get drawn between Moshe's new God and comparing to these polytheistic individual Egyptian gods. So there's a symbol and a meaning and connection to each plague to how they're sort of calling out these old polytheistic gods that are no longer part of their, or referencing their tradition. Now, in the process, and any prophet, this is an important piece, that the prophet has to prove their worth. And so God gives Moshe some tricks. So he has the staff that accomplishes all of these incredible Cecil B. DeMille literal interpretations of things. And at first, Moshe goes to Pharaoh and says, I think you should let our folks go. And on what authority? So he performs his magic tricks, and Pharaoh's impressed at first. And he's really leaning towards freeing the Israelites right then and there. But Pharaoh's own priests, sorcerers, people of faith are able to pretty much duplicate what Moshe is doing. So it's like, deal's off, right? And so now Moshe has to go to plan B. So he won't take the positive, now he's going to get the negative. And now come the plagues. And so the plagues are, the river of blood, the plague of frogs, gnats, flies, the loss of their cattle and livestock, boils, hail and fire, locusts, days of darkness. And the final plague is the killing of the firstborn male. And these are all kind of really negative, destructive things. So the Moshe's tactic at this point, if we won't take the positive, affirmative way, we're going to knuckle them under with the negative, destructive way. And it's kind of the same cycle as before. The Pharaoh's kind of moved by a plague, and either his folks are able to perform the same plague, or they're able to make the plague go away, or something like that. And he changes his mind and says, no deal, you're still slaves. And obviously there's much more to the story, but the last plague, the Hebrew people get the message through Moshe that they are to mark their door frames in a certain way, so that this last plague, killing of the firstborn male, will not affect them. It'll pass over them, either their town of Goshen or their homes, depending on which way you're interpreting this. And they're spared. The first males are spared of the Hebrew people. So now Pharaoh is finally at the point of saying, okay, you're free, you can go. You better get up and get going quick. And the Hebrew people move out quickly. And as they're fleeing the Pharaoh changes his mind, sends out the army, and we all pretty much know how that turns out at the parting of the sea. But in this mythological tale, just consider putting yourself, for example, in the Pharaoh's character. Put yourself in the Pharaoh's position. God, by way of Moshe, is trying to teach Pharaoh a lesson. And this is a lesson of heart. And each time the Pharaoh rescinds his release of the Hebrew slaves, it says he had a hardening of the heart. And he had a change of heart. So this is something that Pharaoh is learning in his heart. And we would just say in our terms, he's learning, he's given an opportunity to do the right thing, right? So how many times have you been, I know in my life, somebody said, well, here's the positive affirmative way. Here's the way to learn this lesson the easy way. And I didn't really get it. And so the next thing that happens is the universe is setting up a whole lot of other lessons that are not so enlightened, that are not so positive. And it's just like the plagues that are visiting the Pharaoh and his kingdom. And, you can learn the easy way or you can learn the hard way. And usually the universe leads with the easy way. And if it doesn't work, the universe says, well, we can work this another way. And the hard way is usually a series of hard knocks. And those hard knocks kind of guide you back to that first lesson, that first offer, which is, here's the lesson you're really meant to get that improves your life, that opens you up. It's the same thing of saying what it ain't, don't say what it am. There are an infinite number of wrong ways to do something, and there's usually a one or two or a few ways to do things correctly. And all the wrong ways only guide you back to making that choice for we'll call it the correct way. And it narrows your choices, if nothing else, to finding and choosing that right path for yourself. So at this point now, the Israelites have fled, and the army gets washed away when the Red Sea comes back together. And it's all downhill from there, right? It's all hunky-dory. Except they are in a free space, an open space, a desert space, an expansive space, no longer in, I forgot the name of the town. But the problem is that the Israelites have the outward appearance of freedom, but they still have a consciousness of slavery. And Moshe, still the reluctant leader, now has a really unruly bunch of people on his hands. And, I just think about the first time that I had some freedom in my life, where I, got my driver's license and it was just me in the car. And right away, I started to push the limits. I started to explore things that were way outside of normal boundaries. And this is what that was happening amongst the Hebrew people. And you can imagine a group of people in this way, all the ways that this can play out. So Moshe is in this continual conversation, this continual connection with God. And so as this stuff is coming up, he's turning this over to God. He's saying, I got all these people free, and they're driving me crazy, and they're killing each other, and they're stealing, and all this terrible stuff. But he's right there with God. And God is saying, here's a set of rules. And you can say it comes from me. And so increasingly, this is the process of sort of creating out of the chaos some order, so that this process for the healing of the Israelites, the healing of this slave mentality, this victim mentality can take place. So Moshe is himself learning some lessons too, and I think that the first thing is to rise above that vortex of negativity. And this is a constant, easy thing for Moshe because he's got this connection with God. He's got this ongoing conversation with God. And this is the way that he stays above this vortex of negativity of the Hebrew people that he's now in charge of. Your inner process is similar. So if you have kind of random, undirected, unruly thought, that's not really very powerful, constructive stuff as compared to constructive and consciously, consistently directed thought. So your spiritual practices of prayer and meditation, of journaling, of affirmation, of doing some spiritual study, visioning, tithing, seeing your spiritual counselor, being of sacred service, joining and immersing in the beloved community. These are all techniques that you use to direct your thought, to be creative and constructive with your thought. So another lesson is to be clear about what you want. Moshe was really clear about what he wanted. He wanted his people freed, and he was rather single-minded about that, and he accomplished that. So your unruly thoughts can really be tamed just by getting clear about what you want. And what do? We add the qualifier, well, this or something better. This or something better, but at least you're clear about that first thing that you want. So Moshe is now involved in leading the Israelites on this 40-year meandering, wandering trip across the desert to the promised land. Now remember, 40 is a symbolic number. It's a big, long number. And so nobody in the Near East is going to trip over whether it was 39 or 41. It was a long time that it took the Hebrew people in this process to begin to shed and heal this slave mentality, their victim consciousness. And that's what primarily that period of time for the Hebrew people was for. So even though you might have some idea of freedom, some idea of liberation, you still might be looking out the window from your prison cell, right? So wandering the desert was healing a slave mentality so that the Israelites can begin to embrace freedom as a spiritual birthright. So like any kind of deep-seated hurt or wound, there are these cycles that take place. So you do a little healing and you work at that mentality. And then from that mentality, that comes up again, and you do a little healing around that. So flash forward several millennia, and now we have Yeshua in a discussion with his disciples. And of course, you know where I'm going with this. This is the famous phrase, if you will know the truth, then that truth will make you free. And of course, the truth, metaphysically, we're talking about is the spiritual truth. If you know the spiritual truth, that very spiritual truth will make you free. And the challenge was that, Jesus languaging that, Yeshua languaging it that in quite that way, his Jewish followers, and he had a mixture of followers by this time in his ministry, but the Jewish followers said, hey, we're descendants of Abraham, meaning we have a verified, we're part of the 12 tribes, the original chosen people, but we've never been enslaved. So, how can you say this? How can you say this about what we consider to be free children of God? And Jesus starts in with, well, if you are committed to error, you become a servant to error. If you're committed to sin, you become a servant to sin. So if you're committed to error, you become a servant to error. And that kind of servant does not stay in the house, which means does not stay present with God. It doesn't stay present for God. It only can stay present with God for temporarily. But the one who comes to the teaching, the one who sticks to the teaching, the one that continues to engage this spiritual truth, they remain with God, children of the Most High God, forever. So he's saying, well, that's and by this he's talking about the new teaching that Yeshua is presenting, and this is again an extension of this long evolution of the growth and maturity of the Hebrew religion, the Judaism at this point. That's what he's saying. That will make you truly become free. And he says that if you don't, he ends this up with something that's a little harsh and says, otherwise you won't have room in your mind for this new teaching. So if you stick to this mentality that, we're children of Abraham who've never been enslaved, we're already free, so we don't have to accept anything new. That's just all we need to work with for my spiritual growth. He's saying, well, if you stick to that, you haven't opened your mind to this new teaching, and therefore you're just going to stay stuck. So your mind is like a parachute. It only works when it's open. So fling your mind wide open, convert this free fall, this unruly thinking, into like a beautiful view and a graceful landing. Freedom is not only escaping the tyranny of your limiting beliefs, it's activating you a lightness of being. It is this full, free breath of spirit. And it is your heart beating free, wide open. It is that heartfelt now liberation. So let's turn together in prayer. So as I turn my attention, as you turn your attention inward, I just call to mind this presence, this Ahia Asharhi, this Most High God, this loving one. And know that that living spirit, that loving one, is everywhere and within. It is felt around and within as a joy, as a love, as an intelligence, as a compassion. It is felt as a creativity of all good things. It perhaps is a health and a well-being. It is all this and so much more. And knowing God to be everywhere and within, I know that I am one with God and one of God. I am an emanation of it. I'm an extension of it. And what is true for me then is true for all beings everywhere. And it's especially true for you and I, us assembled here, right here today. That we are that extension, that emanation, that meditation in the mind of God. We are imbued and dwelled and surrounded with the love and light of living spirit. We are lifted and liberated in every possible, positive, conceivable way, just by being that living spiritual presence. So I speak my word knowing then that within us is that heartfelt liberation, that true freedom. And as you and I declare that as our spiritual birthright, that becomes more and more so in our lives, that we come more in alignment with a world that is free, that a world that is liberated, and therefore our experience, our expression in new and profound ways is one of lightness, of freeing and freer. It is an expression and experience that holds the highest love, the highest regard, the highest connection to all that is good, that force for good in the universe that uses me and that I can use. That comes by way of my heartfelt liberation. So I expand this prayer to include all of our friends and family and loved ones. I see them now drawn into this circle of prayer and love. And I notice that all of us circulate our good in new and profound ways, that you and I bless the world as we are blessed. So I say thank you for this answered prayer. Thank you for this communion in spirit, this teaching, this community. I give great thanks for all that this is. And I release my word into the law of mind and action, knowing that as it is spoken, it is so. That God says yes to more light, to more love, to more liberation, to more freedom, to more full expression of all the good that God is. And that's unfolding, that's happening right now for you, for me. That's happening right now. And together we say, and so it is. Amen.